Well, we're on to our Chapter 12 lecture. This is Chapter 12, Lecture 1. We'll talk about Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands as kind of an overview. And we'll talk about Australia in our, as kind of a Part 1 discussion of environmental and urbanization aspects, geophysical aspects of Australia. This chapter describes the environmental opportunities and challenges and the historic background of settlement and development of Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Island region. It's a vast area that houses about 38 million people in total. This first section, of course, talks about Australia. Another section examines development trajectories and challenges among Australia's neighbors, particularly New Zealand and its need to diversify away from a pastoral economy, and how the Pacific Islands are grouped, and why the Pacific Islands are on the front line of global climate change. The learning outcomes for this chapter include to outline the environmental advantages and disadvantages of the Australian continent, explain the settlement and history of Australia and New Zealand, compare the situation of Aborigines in Australia and the Maoris in New Zealand, identify why Australia and New Zealand are among the most well-off and stable countries in the world, characterize the challenges facing the Pacific Islands, and show how remoteness influences the region's economic opportunities and choices. Finally, explain the importance of Australia's growing relationships with its Australian neighbors. Here first, we'll take a look then at a geophysical map of the region. We see in Australia elevations tend to be highest in the center part of the country and along the Great Dividing Range. Tends to be like a desert plateau to sort of the western and central part of Australia, and the Great Dividing Range to the east creates specific environmental characteristics and climate characteristics that we see affecting the east more. We see very small islands, if you can see them at all, throughout Malaysia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. Melanesia, of course, melon refers to the skin tone of many of the natives in the region, having darker skin. Micronesia refers to many small islands, and Polynesia also refers to many islands, or poly. We see New Zealand to the south here, and including some of its territories, the Auckland Islands and Chatham Islands in the area around it. If we look at this map from page 564 in your text, we get more of a regional definition of the general areas defined as Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. Regions of Australia and New Zealand in this map from page 543 show, first of all, we'll cover New Zealand with one fell swoop. New Zealand has a west coast marine environment, almost exclusively throughout the region, even in the mountains, which are relatively lower mountains, but the change in elevation does not really create a drastic change into what we would call a highland or a mountain climate, and so we refer to the entire area as a marine west coast. We also see the southeastern coast of Australia falls into the marine west coast climate classification as well, tends to be wetter. On the east coast, we see moving up the east coast along the Great Dividing Range, a humid subtropical climate pinned in between the oceans in the east and the Great Dividing Range itself. On the west side of the Great Dividing Range, we see a semi-arid steppe environment. North of that, we move actually into a tropical environment, wet, dry, in the northern part of Australia. Sugarcane is a very common crop in this region. We see a couple of Mediterranean climate regions from Melbourne to Adelaide and to also in the Perth area in the far southwest. Water availability has been the chief influence on population distribution in Australia. Precipitation along the east coast and streams draining the Great Dividing Range that parallel the coast enhance settlement opportunities in the eastern part of the country. The Mediterranean climate, dry summer subtropical in the southeastern portion and south central, is the source of water for these populated areas in the more wet winter periods. The vast central desert surrounded by tropical savanna and steppe environments limits settlement primarily to displaced aborigines, mining operations, as well as sheep and cattle ranching. Environment of Australia, we can consider 5 natural regions: the humid highlands, the core to the east, the Mediterranean southwest and east climates are the most populated regions, the tropical savannas along the northern fringe, the interior is desert or known as the outback, as well as the steppes, and in the far west, an area of ancient rocks, the core region of the Australia continent, or also the Shield. Environmental challenges in Australia include a shortage of arable land, with only 10% of the land really considered arable. Most land requires irrigation for farming. 5% is used for food crops. 40% of the country has ranching as its major economic use. Ranching is suited to Australia's extensive dry conditions, occupies 40% of the land area. It's well managed and watered pastures provide grazing for the cattle. Meat products began to be exported to European markets when refrigerated transportation became available around the 1880s. The meat today is exported to Europe, to East and Southeast Asia, and to the Middle East as well. Australia is particularly vulnerable to climate change. Drier conditions would place severe constraints on available water for irrigated agriculture, particularly in the breadbasket region in New South Wales in the southeast, the Mediterranean region or south central, potentially affecting both domestic consumption and exports. Drier conditions and higher temperatures increase the likelihood of wildfires. Higher temperatures and strong winds can generate firestorms that turn drought-parched vegetation into a lethal inferno. Fire is a natural part of Australia's ecosystems, but can be expected to become increasingly more damaging to humans and more frequent in the future as climate change tends to create higher temperatures here. Early settlement in the region. Until 1788, this region was inhabited by Aborigines, the indigenous population. These peoples numbered up to about 1 million people and had 300 distinct nations. In 1770, Captain Cook sails by the eastern shore, makes note of Australia, and by 1778, the first British ships disembarked at Sydney Cove, beginning a white or European settlement. How's colonization process that occurred in Australia and New Zealand fundamentally different from the one that took place in the United States and Canada? British colonization of Australia and New Zealand occurred about 150 years later than it did in North America. A gold rush in the 1850s stimulated prospectors to come to Australia. and they were followed by prisoners sent there when the British could no longer house them in North America after losing the Revolutionary War. British settlers in North America were, for the most part, farmers. Colonization in New Zealand began after that of Australia and was simulated by eastward migration of the colonists from Australia. Of course, North America was closer to Europe and easier to reach due to favorable ocean currents than was the case for Australia and New Zealand. So those are some of the differences. Australia is about 3 million square miles, 21 million in population. There are large areas of low population density, such as the desert. It has abundant natural resources, much of them spread out through the West. It is similar to the United States in many respects. There is the English language, low density suburban sprawl, a high percentage of automobile ownership, access to manufactured goods and processed foods, shopping in shopping malls, signs of affluent society are common, and also there's highly available internet access. Australia's states and territories. Each state and territory has a primate city. Western Australia has Perth. The Northern Territory has Darwin. South Australia has Adelaide. The Queensland state has the city of Brisbane. New South Wales has the large city of Sydney, the primate city for that region. The Victoria region has Melbourne, and Tasmania has Hobart. Each of these cities is a core peripheral center, the core, with the relationship to their region, and each is a seaport city. These cities support the greatest proportion of the population. Here we see a map of these regions. We see Western Australia and Perth, the Northern Territory and Darwin to the north. We have Queensland with its largest city, Brisbane, Sydney in New South Wales, as well as Melbourne. Two very large cities in these regions. In Victoria here for Melbourne, New South Wales versus Sydney, and South Australia has Adelaide. This southeastern region has the highest population densities, most affluent agriculture, and is the center of governance in Canberra. All right, and finally, for this lecture, the last slide, Australia is an urbanized society. 40% of the population live in the two main metropolitan regions of Sydney and Melbourne. There's a heavy emphasis on industrialization since World War II. All five major cities are seaports. All major cities are capitals of the five mainland states of the Commonwealth, and each has a strong degree of urban primacy. One reason for Australia's highly urbanized society is that its agricultural production is extensive rather than intensive and employs very few people per acre. But there was also an explicit attempt at the time of the Federation of Australia to build an urban rather than a rural society. In addition, especially since World War II, Australia has encouraged industrialization to secure greater economic stability through a more diversified and self-sufficient economy. Much of its industrialization is protected by tariffs and might be considered ISI or import substitution industrialization. Well, that's it for chapter 12, lecture 1, and I'll talk to you again in the next lecture as we continue talking about chapter 12.